Welcome to the Veteran Spouse Network podcast, brought to you in collaboration with Coming Home Well. I'm your host, Hannah O'Brien, both a veteran spouse and the program manager for the Veteran Spouse Network. On each episode of our show, I will host different guests to learn more about the stories, unmet needs, and resources available to our military and veteran families. We're the show that's making space for your stories, so that here you know you're never alone. Welcome back to the Veteran Spouse Network podcast. As we know, November is a huge month for our community. November 11th is, of course, Veterans Day, but November is also National Veterans and Military Families Month, and the VA chooses to recognize our veteran family caregivers in November as well. Of course, at the VSN podcast, we focus on families in all of our episodes, but on this month's episode, we're going to focus on caregiving. And of course, the term caregiver means different things to different people, and we may talk about that a little bit today as well. But I'm very excited to welcome our guest, Amber Vasquez, who is a veteran spouse and caregiver, and she is going to share a bit about her story and her experiences today. So welcome, Amber. I'm so excited to have you with us. I'd love to turn it over to you just to tell us a bit more about you and your family.
I'm excited to be here with you. I'm really glad I get to talk with you, Hannah, and with our community. I'm a recent STEM graduate from UT Austin. I went back to school a little bit later in life and studied math and design thinking and computer science. I'm currently a product manager in tech. I'm a mom to four now adults and one with special needs, and I'm married to my husband. We just celebrated 25 years in the spring, who I also provide advocacy and support to in the caregiver support program with the VA.
And let's hear a little bit more about your family's connection to the military.
Okay, sure. My husband and I met in 1996 and married in 1998. We had 2 children together before he enlisted in the Army. Then we all packed up and moved to Fort Campbell, Kentucky, when he was assigned to his first duty station. He was assigned to the 101st Airborne as an 11 Hotel Air Assault Infantryman with the hopes to go green to gold and later maybe get into intelligence. We arrived on post in August of 2001, which was a month before 9/11. And our idea that serving in a peacetime military ended there and the green to gold program was paused.
Wow, I seriously can't imagine that. And I know you guys, a lot of people were in that boat, had a very different plan. Wow. So you mentioned your kids. Tell me a little bit more about your 4 kids.
Yeah, well, like I said, we had a couple of kids before we went to the military. And while we were active duty, we had our 3rd child just before Operation Iraqi Freedom, which is where my husband was deployed to combat. He was in the initial shock and awe campaign. And while he was in combat, our 3rd daughter was diagnosed with multiple severe disabilities at 6 months of age. After I noticed that she wasn't meeting her milestones, they diagnosed her with cerebral palsy, epilepsy, visual impairment, and severe developmental and intellectual delay. This obviously was a pretty heartbreaking period of time dealing with the stressor of war and her disability. He ended up separating in early 2005, and we moved to Austin, Texas, with the hopes of being closer to good medical care, some family members, and maybe a second chance at education.
A lot of families do that as well. Move to Texas in the hopes that we're a big veteran state and we have all this good stuff. And I think we're going to talk a little bit about the reality of that later. But so you're a caregiver in a couple different ways. And so I'd love to hear a little bit more about what caregiving means to you, because I know it means different things to different people. And I think sometimes people do have this really kind of strict definition of what it means to be a caregiver. And then also some people I know that are spouses like us may not wish to define themselves that way because they're saying, well, I'm doing my duty as a spouse. So I'm just curious, what does caregiving mean to you?
That's interesting. And when I thought of this question, I thought of it in regards to my loved one, my spouse, initially. So let me talk a little bit about that. To me, being a caregiver means providing a bridge to the community. And the community includes other people. It includes resources, medical, mental health care, in our case, a spiritual community, the veteran community, and more. It meant offering tools to help my loved one do that and make those connections. So one example I'll give is like when he got a service dog. The service dog really taught the value of connecting to others, even when you're just like at the coffee shop or the grocery store. People tend to recognize the presence of a dog and show some interest in a positive way. And I found that really interesting as a way to pull someone dealing with isolation a little bit more into the world of others. So that was an idea of a bridge to the community. And it's just been a continual process of doing that pretty slowly over a long amount of time. It also means solving issues and then modeling to my loved one how to do that, like modeling functional behaviors, responses, good communication, how to connect and how to have relationship, because it felt like a lot of what we dealt with was relearning those things. Modeling problem solving skills and also like knowing what to do in a crisis moment, and slowly hoping I can hand small things back to him that would have normally been his responsibility. It also means that all of this work I do is to work myself out of the role of a caregiver. And that's been my goal. And I'll say this is a common theme I have in connection with our special needs daughter and my loved one, because it's very much about creating independence and access to things, no matter what the person would be struggling with or has barriers of. So my loved one can step in eventually and function in those areas with less and less support over time. And I always think that growth is possible, even progress in the smallest of ways. And so far, that philosophy has worked out really well.
I love that. And I don't hear that as much in the caregiver conversation about trying to kind of work yourself out of the role and, that hopeful sense. And that's awesome that you've seen that happening in your role with your partner. So you talked a lot about what caregiving looks like for you, but how else do you see yourself as a caregiver?
I had a little bit of a hard time answering this. And then all of a sudden, I came up with an idea that I really do see myself as a strong and reliable person in other people's lives that I am supporting. I've found resilience, resourcefulness. I've learned to be more caring and more empathetic and emotionally wise. Like I've learned things I wouldn't have learned otherwise. I see myself as a problem solver and as my loved one's biggest supporter to reach their life goals and their dreams. When you talk about caregiving as a mom, I see myself as someone who kind of went all in and loved them like as hard as I possibly could, even in some of these circumstances where there was struggle included. Solving problems and opening doors for them and helping them have the best foundation I could offer educationally and relationally at home and in our community. To my special needs daughter, especially, a lot of skills I use as a veteran supporter, I use for her all the time and more. They do have their varied needs, but they also have some similarities. And it was all honestly overwhelming and often just too much. All of our kids were growing up pretty close together. We were dealing with what is going on after the Army and what is this stuff that's happening, because there wasn't really a label in the beginning that we were educated on. But for my typically developing kids, this helped them grow to be resilient and understanding themselves because they were dealing with all these same things from their own perspective as well.
That's interesting that you bring up your children in the sense, because I know in the community right now, one of the things they're trying to advocate a lot for is children as caregivers. What do they call that? Hidden helpers. Is that, I think that's like terminology they're using. So I'm just curious. I know I didn't ask you this in advance, but if you've seen your children kind of step into that role, whether that be to support with your partner or with your other child, and how that's been.
Yes, of course. Probably more often than they would have liked or I would have planned for them. And it's happened in both scenarios. And a lot of people may identify with an example when we go somewhere as a family. Our children are very aware of the things that are triggering in an atmosphere. They learn quite quickly, picking up from what dad's saying or doing. Oh yeah, the exits are over here, and I know my dad wants to sit at this part of the room, and so we automatically make sure we're all taking care of those little needs that we're aware of. And I think it was a lot more obvious in a physical sense with our daughter who had disabilities, because she was creating a lot more drama in public spaces, and they were learning to cope with many little crisis moments of her throwing a temper tantrum or something. And which siblings can do even in a typically developing family, but she just kind of continued those behaviors longer than most children would. And they've also helped seizure responses at our home. And we got to a point where, like, this kid calls 911, this kid opens the front door for the fire department, and this kid runs and gets the medicine. And wow, we had a lot of helpers.
Yeah.
Everyone sort of took on a role in a very real way, providing care for each other. So that's definitely happening.
That's awesome to hear, and that it got to that point of that high functioning. It was actually probably quite helpful, I imagine. Anything
But
else? Oh, go ahead.
I have to say, yes, they were helpful. Yes, it was terrifying and scary for a kid who's not like emotionally immature to deal with these things, It's a little bit heartbreaking, but families don't have these choices when you're in the middle of dealing with these things. So the next question for me was, how do I help them process this? How do I help them heal on their level the things that are bothering them? Or just talk about things. Who can I find in the community that can assist them in kind of growing through these things, and hopefully it not becoming a hindering point, but wisdom and maturity that they can take with them as adults.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I appreciate you saying that. There's nothing easy about that. But I really like your outlook and how to support them along that, and use it as a positive as they grow into being adults, and what they can kind of take with them from it. Because I'm sure it's a lot of useful things have come from it.
They really are quite wonderful human adults, and
Yeah.
they amaze me every day. And I know it was a mix of all the things that helped them become who they are, and I'm quite proud of them for it.
Amazing. So, kind of circling back to your caregiver journey, and thinking more about your spouse, pardon me, voice, specifically. I know y'all had a journey, specifically around substance abuse that we wanted to talk a little bit about. So I'll let you kind of expand more on that.
Sure. My spouse was injured during his tour of combat in an ambush in Fallujah. He was knocked unconscious by a mortar blast for a few seconds, as I understand it, maybe 15. When returning to consciousness, he chose to push forward with his team and not be taken back to the rear for medical attention. And this resulted in untreated TBI and PTSD from his experience that when he was separated in 2005, we were not educated about or aware of as we drove to Austin for a fresh start. A lot of his separation was because he got out of contract and our daughter was diagnosed with a disability. So he didn't have that traditional come home with your group and be transitioned by your unit, then go home to your family and talk to them. I picked him up in an airport in Nashville, Tennessee, 3 days after he left Mosul. That was his transition time. And at the time I was like, great, that's awesome, whatever. Like, I did not comprehend
Yeah.
how that was going to affect us in the future. And over the next couple of years, his ability to function just slowly deteriorated. It felt like at first, I have a new mission. My daughter needs support. I can do this. And it just wasn't possible. And he kind of kept hitting his limits. And as a result, started self-medicating to cope. And this went on, and there's a lot of different things that come with substance abuse as far as caregiving and behaviors and dealing with situations than just other types of caregiving. But I just started searching for answers all the time and trying to get help with the VA and all the things that we do. He eventually became service connected at a lower rating, and then 100% 10 years later in 2015. And I feel like that's when he started to begin making some progress in a bigger way, because he had the space to do some recovery work. But he got sober in the summer of 2014, and he has been sober since. It's been a very interesting journey in regards to the differences between pre-sobriety and sobriety, and how he's dealt with PTSD then versus now. And it's more than I wanted to know, but I'm happy that he's been able to grow in that way.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's layered. And I know even when we talked about this a little bit, but like when you're doing treatment, sometimes they won't even let you, engage in certain treatments that could be effective for PTSD until you have your substance use handled.
It's true. I checked up on that. He's so much to say about this. I think it is the case that if you need to have substance abuse recovery treatment before you're able to attend a post-traumatic stress disorder treatment program with the VA, they, at least in our Central Texas area, deal with that by going to the Temple mental health unit for a couple of weeks or for a certain amount of time. And they just deal with the sobriety there in their own way. It's not like a specific 12-step program or a specific treatment place like we have privately out here. My husband ended up going to not a VA affiliated recovery program that involved a lot of 12-step work, a lot of options in yoga and meditation work. He tended to gravitate towards those things and has held on to them as ways to cope with stuff. And honestly, it surprises me how well he has done. So I'm really proud of him about that. But what I thought was really great about the VA, when he returned from his inpatient program for a few months, there was a group here called the Substance Abuse Treatment Program, where he met with them once a week. And this was with the idea of being able to continue sobriety and get support in your recovery. And he's to this day still attending that group. And it has been really great to have their support and implement all the things and talk about connections and how to deal with the world. And it's just the same, mostly core group of people that learn how to kind of grow through each other's issues or each other's differences and ideas, kind of like you would in a family, like a very extended family, like everyone's going to have different opinions. How do you deal with that? Mm-hmm. So I think they've done a great job with that program, and I think it's something they still offer.
Just the consistency alone of that is huge, and that peer-to-peer, which obviously we know, is so effective, not just for veterans, but the family members as well. So I'm happy to hear that.
Very effective.
So some of this has come through just you telling your story, but we're not going to pretend that caregiving is an easy thing to do, period, every day, what have you. So what are some of the things that you think are difficult about being a caregiver?
Sure. Keep in mind that I started my journey around 2005, which compared to today, I think is a much different landscape of awareness. So the first thing I thought of is that the culture generally had a lack of understanding around mental health and veteran issues. I don't even think we were coining PTSD as a term when I started looking for assistance. So I found that very challenging. It was like this mysterious landscape of what are we dealing with? Nobody knows. I thought it's also challenging the amount of time recovery takes. I very, very much underestimated that time and still continue to do so right now as we speak. I think I'm too hopeful for my own good sometimes, honestly, and then it gets me in the end. I thought it was challenging to change my expectations of life and my long-term goals. And I find that this is a grieving process that comes and goes as life happens in waves. I think, oh, I've processed that. And then all of a sudden, something I would have never expected comes up that, oh, it should have been this way in my head. It's not. I need to be sad about that. Like once in a while, I kind of have to go back. And I do this with my daughter's life as well, not just like my life with my spouse and what I thought we would do versus what we're actually doing.
But to comment on that, I think I really appreciate you kind of almost coining that of grieving, that being a process. Cause I think if you're not willing to grieve it, then that's when it like becomes or can become resentment, which we hear a lot about in this community in general, but especially if our spouses are kind of picking up those heavier handed caregiving roles. And, that's real. But I think that saying, yes, this is a huge change and something that I should grieve the life we could have had or didn't have, or what, whatever that is important so that it doesn't become that what if.
Yeah, I agree. I do think resentment is still hard to avoid, even if you're willing to feel the sadness of what you thought life would be, because it's really hard to give up some stuff that you want.
Oh my gosh, of course. Yeah. And we all, we build up expectations, whether we know we should or shouldn't. And, then life throws you 5 million curveballs. What do you do? So what about something we hear a lot with our community is also how caregiving can affect the intimate partner relationship. So I'm curious to know what you found helpful to really help kind of maintain that spousal relationship and that partner to partner connection with your husband.
Of course. I think it's challenging to not fall in. There's this risk of creating a relationship of dependency as a caregiver that sometimes can tax the core relationship of just being in love and being a spouse. And I really try to guard that with my life. It can be challenging because the worlds get intertwined. And I've said more than once, my husband will tell you, that I just want to be your wife. Like there's been many conversations where I just want to be your wife. You do that and you do that because we need to just relate to each other and have a good time and connect and not forget that that's where we started. So I would say, as far as finding time for myself and protecting my own mental health, I teach like the person that I'm supporting the value of my own self-care and my kids. And, like kind of have to teach everyone you're taking care of. Like the kids are the hardest ones to understand this concept sometimes because they were born to need you and that's normal. But it included good boundaries for me. And when I say that, I don't mean bubble baths and massages. I mean, even though those are great tools, I mean the ability to say that I'm willing to do something and I'm not willing to do something. And having the ability to express what I think is somebody else's responsibility now and ask them to take things on as they grow, which kind of goes back to my idea of like, I am doing this job to work myself out of this job. And what comes with that is being able to kind of push just a little bit and say, can you do this? Can I delegate this to you now? And often that means repeating something, like showing someone how to do something 5 times in a row. And then the 6th time they can do it. And try not to get frustrated with that, which is probably another weakness of mine. Like, just understand it the first time I tell you. But I think there's a saying like that some people hear what you're saying, like when you're finally tired of saying it. Then they finally understand you.
I'm dealing that with my husband right now. Ever since we had our baby, I feel like his memory is just like gone. So I'm actually taking your advice. Okay, be patient, say the thing 5 times.
Yeah. Something else that has helped us maintain connection and relationship has been attachment therapy. It's been a really interesting modality of couples therapy that has taken us really far. And so throughout my husband's recovery journey, we've maintained a couples therapy appointment for quite some time, over 10 years. And this really helped us work through the hard stuff with somebody else, but also build skills to have a thriving life. And And we learned, what I found really interesting for us was we learned how to create a safe space for each other at home. So when we were healing and working really hard at these mental health appointments or with our doctors, we could come home to something without having to, I don't know, get spun up again. And our healing wasn't cut short, for example. So like, let me just give you an example that might be easier. If I went to an EMDR treatment and came home, I knew I wasn't going to walk into like a toxic relationship pattern that felt unsafe or created more anxiety or unease. And as for him, like if he attended a support recovery group, like the one we talked about at the VA, and returned home, I learned to be mindful of the experience he was coming from and kind of make a space to hear the things he needed to process and experience with me, without judgment, but just being curious and listening in an empathetic way. And I will say, like, all of this takes practice if it's not something you were taught already. So lots and lots of practice, lots of, falling down, trying up again. But I wasn't and immediately be like, hey, I need some stuff at the store. And here's the 10 things I've been waiting to ask you, like the second he walks in the door. Because there's always this possibility when you leave really intense like therapy appointments, for example, of kind of being left open a little bit, and a little bit too open in a way that it can feel scary. So having that ability to come home and attach with one another in a safe place really complemented like all of the hard work that we were putting into our individual stuff. So another example is a technique that we started really early, which is just very simple. You just hug each other when you come home and when you're about to leave. And I think there's families that probably just do this naturally. But we made it a point, like, because we wouldn't always like, oh, bye, you're just like running out the door. It's really easy to just go. And then that attachment feels a little unattached, if you will. So we make sure like we hug each other abdomen to abdomen. We did this with our kids when we learned about it. We're like, oh, this is really important. When we returned home. And this is because it helps us borrow each other's nervous systems and helps us regulate one another. And it also helps, like, it helped me feel like I arrived home to my husband, who I adore and I love, and him, me. And that home kind of became the hug, not really the space of the brick house I was walking into. So now, like, I do this all the time also with my special needs daughter, and it works so wonderfully for her. When she's just upset, she tends to spiral, and it's really hard for her to regulate in general. She just can't calm down. And if she's willing, I'll just open my arms and offer her a hug. Now, there are times she's like, no. Usually she'll just walk right into them without admitting that she needs it. And her hug will last a while, and slowly you feel her calming down. Her crying goes from really loud to really soft and like manageable. And okay, then she starts talking, usually while we're still hugging. I just feel like blah, blah, blah. And the words get this capability to start being spoken. But even if the words are not speakable, like the regulation happens, and it's just been an amazing thing to watch.
Yeah, I just listening to you, that sounded so powerful. And you did make me think too, because I mean, you said, oh, maybe families are doing this naturally. But then when you said that, I'm like, do we? Like, because I think you're so right. It gets easy to not even think about it, so that intentionality of that mindfulness of whatever the practice is you feel is key for your relationship, your family, and just doing it and being consistent is really everything. I mean, you talked a little bit about caring for yourself. Anything else I think that's important regardless of what role you're serving as a parent or in your relationship. But anything else you think is really important or you do to make sure you're putting you first?
Sure. I will say I love the soft and fluffy things. I do take a bath every night as a ritual, and I'll schedule massages. I am not shy about pampering myself when I need to, or even on a routine. But I have learned, for example, something I really, really need is stability. I look for it, I crave it, I want things to be the same every day. It's definitely not possible, like especially in life, we all know things change. And if there's one thing that's certain is that life will just keep changing. I don't have an agreement with life about this. Like, I'm still resisting, but a way that I meet my own needs and take care of myself is I say, okay, well, how can I give myself the stability I'm looking for? And that kind of comes in with like, I will take a bath every night at 9 o'clock. And I give myself like these anchors throughout the day that I can count on happening, because I can deal with things changing a little bit easier. But when I don't have some kind of stability to work from, I just tend to feel like everything's crazy and I can't process it, and I get overwhelmed a little bit faster. So I feel like that's like a very important thing I need to continue to make sure I do to take care of myself. As a good an example.
I love that. And you're using so many terms I just want to like use in 500 other things. Like I love that anchor, that terminology.
Yeah.
I'm stealing
I
it. Anchor, find your anchors, y'all. No, and I think that's so important because you're right. There's so much we can't control. So if you can just find the little things that you can control, that can make a really huge impact for your sanity, for your peace, your balance.
mean, the alternative is like, hey, can my husband be stable?
Yeah, but straight up, one of us has to have something going on. Oh, I love it. Earlier, you mentioned a little bit about boundary setting, which I think is a really important and powerful tool for self-care and relationship care, honestly. So I was wondering if you'd tell me a little bit more about how it's not an easy thing to do. So how that journey has been for you in setting boundaries.
Sure. I found boundaries to be one of the most helpful ways in prioritizing myself and caring for myself, setting them and enforcing them. When I think about boundaries, it really makes me slow down and recognize what agreements I'm willing to make with myself and with other people. Because I realized in the beginning, before I knew a lot about boundaries, just kind of running head on into situations, reacting, doing what I thought was best with my old coping mechanisms that weren't really working for other people or myself. So boundaries will keep me in a place that I know I can handle something, and out of spaces I know I cannot handle things. And I've put thought into that scenario thinking before things out of my experience and learning, okay, when this happens next time, this is what I would do. An example of this was dealing with suicidal ideation in my caregiving role. And when I was younger, I didn't really know how to handle it. I felt like I had to be responsible and that I needed to be the person that they leaned on. And it was just out of my depth. And all the while, when someone that I love is thinking about something like this, I'm having my own experience of being terrified about losing somebody, or how it made me feel in general. So I made a boundary that I was like, okay, when this happens, this was pre-crisis line era, I will call someone for help, like trained people for help. And, with therapy and agreements that we've made with other people, we decided the sheriff department at the time was the people that we were supposed to call for help. So when that happened, I would call a sheriff for help. And this happened a few times and they were always easy to work with. And I know that's not always the case for everyone. So today that's maybe not the best answer, but they just do a well check. If everything seems like it's okay, then it's okay. If it's not, the VA will take you into the mental health center at any time of day and help you. So that was our protocol. And that was my boundary. Like, I don't have to know how to respond to this crisis and go, oh, he's okay, or determine the outcome, because if I'm wrong, then I would feel so responsible for being wrong. But leaning on community resources and leaning on mental health professionals and just knowing like, okay, this is what I do next. And it also gave that person those community touch points and that modeling to be like, oh, when I feel this way, I can talk to these people, and maybe not necessarily my spouse, because that is too hard for that person to deal with. And then I know it's important to be able to talk to people, but I'm talking more of like in that crisis moment when things kind of come to a head about it. I know it's a really serious example of a boundary, but it was a really, really helpful one.
And honestly, I think that's a good example and actually an important example, because I think I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of spouses are in here, or family members in general are listening to that, feeling similar in the sense that like, I don't know that I can handle that, right? Or I don't know, even if you've been through trainings and stuff, it's just different when you're in the moment and it's the person that you love, and there is so much fear. I've been there too. And um your boundary, it's not saying like, oh, please go figure it out on yourself, right? You found what that support was. So like you are properly reacting, but you're also protecting yourself. So I think that's a perfect example, and one that probably is going to be quite helpful for some people to hear who might be feeling the same. Amber, this has been amazing. And I like to ask, although you're our first guest, but I'm going to do this in the future, kind of finish out with a question of, if you could leave our listeners with one piece of advice, wisdom, whatever it might be, what would you share with them?
Okay. I think I would say that I learned that we don't heal in isolation and that we heal in relationship to others. And that I really think community matters a lot. You do need your own supporters too, as you are supporting others. And that's part of where community comes in, as well as your loved ones and your family and friends. I would say, do not give up finding this, no matter what you need to do. Just keep trying. I've given up on myself a few times to find that, and then realized the bounty of continuing and having that community that really supported us through all of this. It's not just a caregiver who did this to help her family, but the community that surrounded us and supported us for that. I'm still also like working really hard to rebuild new friendships now that my kids are grown and my spouse is doing so much better than he used to when we started. And I'm finding I have this freedom I didn't used to have, but I often will still keep myself in these small spaces. Like I can't move because I'm still doing those things I used to do, and kind of relearning like it's okay. And staying connected to people in these relationships really helps me realize that. And I work hard on this and I accept that. And I mean, we're always going to grow and learn and keep practicing and get up and try again. So keep doing that.
Keep doing that. And I love that, kind of giving yourself permission to grow yourself, honestly, and to reinvest in yourself as you move out of this role that or in ways that you move out of this role. It's never fully done, or it just then it becomes being a spouse and a parent, which is still
That's what it is, honestly, now. And I know this isn't a structured question, but like he's giving back to me in the same ways I've given to him in so many ways. And it's become quite reciprocal and more of a relationship the way you would give to somebody in a normal circumstance where they're having a downturn in life, and not this big, heavy, like caregiver monster PTSD military thing, but it's like, oh, that's what people do.
yeah, this is
And
how
that's
relationships
been
work.
really nice because I'll say informally, like, if you give your loyalty to an infantryman, you're going to get so much loyalty back. Like the day will come that you will not regret this because
Yes,
they were
it
a
pays.
team. They survived together. You know what I mean? And I've gotten it back 1,000-fold.
Yeah. I've even had I had a friend who ended a long-term relationship with a veteran. Just they were going in different directions. And she was like, I think I need to date another veteran though, because there's just so many but she really was talking about that, that commitment, that loyalty, um, that just she never really had in another relationship and met anyone like. So there's so many positives. Uh,
I worried one day that I would regret like spending a certain amount of my life doing something, and I do not. I do not regret it at all.
yeah. Well, that sounds like an amazing place to kind of close out. Amber, I seriously appreciate you coming on, sharing your story, being open and vulnerable. I know it means a lot to me, and I hope it means a lot to our listeners. So if you're listening, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks again for joining us on the Veteran Spouse Network podcast, brought to you in collaboration with Coming Home Well. We thank you for listening today and hope today's session left you feeling a little more connected or gave you some insight into the experiences of our military and veteran families. Don't forget to check us out at veteranspousenetwork.org to learn more about how our military and veteran families can receive the support they deserve.